At the beginning of worship this morning, we heard the words of Jesus found in John 6. And we can appreciate that these are words of Jesus because the words and the actions of Jesus make it clearer to us what God has been doing all along with God's people in every age and every group of people. In John 6, Jesus has already fed 5,000 people miraculously with bread and fish. And now he's telling a crowd, I am the bread of life. We've moved from this miracle where God is going to physically feed people to show God's work to this metaphor that it's not just bread that we need for today and tomorrow so that our body might live, but it's something that our entire being needs for all of eternity. Jesus is not just a miracle worker. He is the miracle. He is the one who will provide for us. Jesus is making God's will clear for us to see, that God wants to provide what we need so that we can live for today, and so that we can live for eternity. We see this desire throughout the Gospels as Jesus feeds people, as Jesus heals people, as Jesus even raises people from the dead. And we see that this desire for life, to give life, and to conquer with life over death through God's action of restoring Jesus to life in the resurrection, a powerful source of life, and a powerful source of life for everyone, which we see as Jesus speaks to Samaritans and women and outsiders. And then the Holy Spirit empowers the disciples to keep going, to spread this message to everyone, that Jesus is the bread of life for everyone, and that God desires life for all, life abundant. However, we don't see this in the same way in the text about Elijah that we just read from 1 Kings. Instead of life, we see a prophet who has just been victorious and slain the prophets of the false god Baal. But now this human messenger terrifies him with a death threat. Now Elijah responds by fleeing into the desert, not into a garden where he might be able to hide and get some food, not to a city where maybe he could find someone to help him. Instead, he chooses to be alone. We see this man who has this great public victory that everyone knows about, including the king and queen. But now he's alone and isolated and depressed. We see this depressed attitude when we look at Elijah sending his servant away, sitting under a solitary broom tree, the only tree on this scene. One prophet, one tree, all alone, and in his cry to take away my life. This is a prophet who is laying down, not working, and isolated. When we pair this with the suicidal ideation we just heard, it sounds like what we today understand as depression. But why is Elijah depressed? When we read it, we can see that there's a death threat. But I think we also need to ask if maybe it defies explanation. Because someone who has experienced a victory, we would expect to be happy. And we might even tell him to be happy in the face of fear. So if it's this death threat that Elijah has been told that Jezebel wants to make him just like those other dead prophets, then we can read this text and pray for those in our own world who feel unsafe. Those whose life is threatened, whether that is in the United States or abroad. that we can read this text and see a prophet that God loved who experienced the same thing. And perhaps with this fear for his life, we can identify and read it on behalf of those who fear for their own future, who are so concerned that they won't be able to find a bright future somewhere, that their only end is going to be a violent one, that we can see them in this prophet today. This prophet who continued to be sought by God, even when he feared violence. But I think we also need to read this on behalf of all those who have depression that just doesn't make sense. And we know this is a part of our world today, that people experience depression even when they're seen as successful, even when they've had great things happen in their life. That depression can still happen. And it's something that we as Christians struggle with, because we know and we are told and we understand that God brings joy to us. And we understand that God heals us. So when someone is depressed, when they're a Christian, sometimes we struggle with what to say. It doesn't make sense to us. It's unexplained. And instead of being happy as a Christian or being joyful, we struggle, and it just feels even worse. Instead, we can choose to support each other with the resources in our community and medical resources and the counseling that can help people when there isn't a good, definite reason for why they're depressed. Despite any talent or a strong sense of purpose or a strong community of support, sometimes depression does happen. And we can see that in this prophet and read it in solidarity with all of those who face depression. So what do we do? What do we see with this victorious public figure who's now hiding away in a desert where there's no food, there's chaotic wild animals, and there's no one that he can call to for help? How does God respond to this prophet whose life has been threatened, this prophet that should be happy, but he's obviously not? How can the bread of life that Jesus talks about make sense for the prophet Elijah? How can this be true for Elijah and for us? In this text, we don't see God saying, just smile and it'll go away eventually. There's no sense of grin and bear it. There's no sense of do better, be better, you can do it. There's no sense of mind over matter. You can walk this off, Elijah. We don't see that. Instead, God sends a messenger to bring him food. The NRSV says a cake. Other translations say a cake of bread. And no one can agree on what the cake is. A little bit like manna. We don't have an ancient recipe for cake of bread. But we know that this is bread for Elijah. And it's been given by a messenger. And this is where we see our first sign of hope, is that what the NRSV translates as angel, that the angel of the Lord came and brought this cake of bread to Elijah, is the Hebrew word malach. Y'all paid for my Hebrew, and now you get to hear it. But this is malach, it's a messenger. This is the exact same word that is used for the human messenger that Jezebel sent. It's a messenger, something that we can all be, sometimes a divine one, like an angel, or maybe a messenger, like all of us. Someone who can bring a cake or bread or a cake of bread to someone in need. Perhaps this is where we can imagine the start of hope coming from us and coming from angels. And we see the relationship between Elijah and God during this time. That God visits Elijah through this messenger, and all he's told to do is to eat, and then he gets to go back to sleep. That is God's relationship with the prophet that God is desiring. To simply rest, to simply provide for Elijah when he needs to be provided for. And then this second day, there's the cake of bread again, and Elijah gets to sleep some more, but instead this messenger is coming to Elijah and says, get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you. And there's a lot there in this message, that the journey will be too much for you if you don't eat this bread. But one of the clearest things we can see is that God is not done with Elijah yet. Now, Elijah is still given another day to just eat this bread and rest a little bit, and it's on this bread that Elijah is able to travel to a safer cave. But God is not giving commands yet. God is just saying that there's a future. Something difficult for many of us, and difficult for those who worry about their safety in the face of violence, and a future that is so hard to picture for those who are struggling with suicide. But here it is. Eat this bread, otherwise the journey will be too much for you. And on the third day, God comes to Elijah with these miraculous signs, these flashy signs of an earthquake and fire and wind. And Elijah seems to be a similar person because what really gets him out of the cave, what really he responds to, is the sound of sheer silence. That is the message and the God that Elijah can understand. That's where God was, in the silence, not in the big and powerful, but in the silence. We see in this story the truth about God and how God reaches out to us, that God responds to our sadness and to our fear for the future by giving us bread, by giving us messengers, and by allowing for silence. It's grace to those who haven't earned it. Bread to the prophet who isn't doing anything, who's just going to take another nap. That is the God that we see here, the God who feeds people who say, "Take away my life." Talk about being done. And here, God stands ready to feed Elijah again and again. It's the words of the prophet. In Isaiah 55, we read, "Everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. And you that have no money, come, buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without price." How can someone without money possibly buy anything? It doesn't make sense from our perspective on the world. So what kind of radical God is this who will give food to Elijah, the unproductive, depressed prophet? Who is this God who tells his prophet that you can give bread at no price, that anyone can buy bread without a price? And who is this God who comes into the world to feed 5,000 people without asking for any money, without asking even for their email so you can contact them later? That's our usual deal now. Who is this God? What kind of God is so committed to the lives of people in Elijah's time, in the prophet Isaiah's time, in Jesus' time, and in our time, that God would give and give and give so that we might have life? What kind of God comes as Jesus and says, "I am the bread of life, and this bread is my flesh," and then offers that body for the sake of the world? What kind of God gives and gives and gives when we haven't done anything to deserve it, when we have no money to buy it, when we have no work to earn it, but simply gives and allows us to rest. This is grace, a particular kind of grace that we can see. And it's what we need to keep living, even when our society tells us that we get our value and we earn our bread through our work. It is through our work and our talents and our skills and what we give back that earns our place in the world, right? It's what we do that makes us valuable. And yet here we see a different perspective on God. That what we do and what we promise to do in the future does not define us. Instead, bread is given to prophets who do all the great stuff and the prophets who say that they're done. So for all the students, myself included, who will be going back to school, for those who always feel like they've got a test coming up, or another book that they really should be reading, or another paper that they really should be starting this weekend, you can remember that God gives us moments of rest, even when there are deadlines, even when we are tired. God gives us rest without demanding something on the deadline. For those who always think that they should be doing better, but never seem to actually get there. For those of us who seem to make mistakes instead of learning from them, we can know that regardless of the results we bring, there's an offering of bread. It is hard for us to choose to rest and be fed when we feel pressure to be productive at all times. As a North Dakotan who grew up surrounded by farmers who knew how to do everything and could take care of themselves, as a girl who grew up reading the Little House on the Prairie books, where they just keep taking care of themselves. In the long winter, they'll take care of themselves and maybe they'll get help from someone else. This pioneer attitude is how we've survived here. But it also tells us that we should be taking care of ourselves because of the realities we see in the world. And yet God tells us that God will take care of us even if all we do is sit down and eat and sleep. That there is a promise that our work is not what actually gets us by. It is God and God's grace, whether we have money to buy bread or we have work so that we have earned it, that there is simply bread for us, regardless of what we do. God gives to the prophet because the prophet needs it. I have seen this radical gift of good things to those who aren't acting like they deserve it seen when I have repeatedly seen a parent with a toddler having a temper tantrum. And we've all seen that. And I've looked at parents as their kid is like kicking and screaming on the ground and like rolling around and being so loud, and I've seen the parents be embarrassed. I've seen it. And then I've seen the parents wait it out, and then I've seen them offer their kid a juice box, because kids are usually really thirsty after this ordeal, and offer them some Cheerios, because we tend to have those. And then I've seen them just pick up their entire toddler and put them on their shoulder and go home. A kid who hasn't earned it, a kid who hasn't apologized, and yet is still loved and will be loved even if it happens again. That despite the embarrassment, despite the effort, there's just love. There's just an offering of juice boxes and Cheerios and a nap on the way home to the little kid who hasn't earned it. We do have a part to play in bringing God's kingdom to earth. We have been given the instructions to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And that's an active role, but we are not called to be active at all times. When we need to rest, like Elijah, God doesn't guilt us for it. God offers bread and a place to rest, and we hope that God's messengers will help us out with that. So, with this truth about God's will to give life and to give rest to all, even those who aren't productive enough to earn it, even those who haven't deserved it, will we join in God's work of offering that bread as a messenger, regardless of the promises that someone has or hasn't made? Will we see God's will being done as we simply accept the bread and the rest that God offers to us? Let's simply eat and simply allow God to be the one that feeds us, and know that God offers us a future and isn't done with us yet. May it be so, friends. May it be so.